Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to get started in just a minute, but before we begin, I'm just going to give you a brief overview of the platform and let you know how today's agenda is going to go. My name is Alicia Lord, and I'll be the technical host for today's session. If you have any questions or troubles with seeing the presentation or audio, please let us know in the chat box, and I'll private chat you so that we can get those resolved. Please also enter in any questions you may have for the presenter in the chat. We will have Q&A at the end of the session so that you'll be able to either unmute yourself or ask questions directly. Today's presentation is by Karen Weber, and we're going to turn it over to her. Thank you.
Great, thanks for tuning in, everyone, and special thanks to the National Center for having me and letting me share all my fun knowledge that my team and I have been working on over the past few years. By way of background, I got involved on E-MDTs back in 2012 when they were starting up. I was doing a lot of forensic accounting outside of the E-MDT structure here in New York State, and got partnered up with the E-MDT program. And we now serve, my team members and I, on about 40 teams across New York State. So we have a lot of experience, whether you are a rural team, a suburban team, dense urban team. Hopefully we can answer the questions that you have. The technical assistance coordinators have been putting together all of your questions all the way along. So this is kind of an FAQ session where we give you a lot of information. So objectives for today is understanding, if you don't already know, what a forensic accountant is and how to find one. And I think we have, if you wouldn't mind putting yourself on mute, I'm getting some background noise. I'll open it up to questions at the end and you can unmute yourselves at that point. We'll talk about what the role of the forensic accountant is on your team, what expectations you should have based on whether that accountant is embedded in your law enforcement office or whether you hire one out of the community. We'll talk about the case referral process and what different types of deliverables a forensic accountant might be able to produce for your cases. We're going to address some confidentiality concerns because that's come up a lot. Identify some contract terms when you are engaging a forensic accountant. And then I'll give you some public access tools for investigating these cases that will hopefully help you kind of marshal your forensic accounting resources and use them appropriately. So for those of you who have not heard of forensic accounting or at least worked with a forensic accountant, the Cambridge Dictionary defines forensic accounting as a process of examining a person's or organization's financial records to figure out whether a crime has been committed. So what that means in real life terms, if I can, there we go. The word forensic actually refers to evidence. So when we're talking about forensic accounting for your elder abuse cases, we're talking about providing numbers-based evidence for your legal cases. In broader terms, we provide non-traditional
here in Fort Belknap
services. Still getting some feedback if you can put yourself on mute. So what non-traditional accounting services means is forensic accountants don't generally do financial statement audits or prepare tax returns. We do things like litigation support. One of the cases I talk about a lot in my prior work, I spent 5 years with a firm before starting my own practice. And we were working on an arson case. And basically we had to prove that a landlord whose house or rental house burned down didn't have a financial motivation to burn that house down and collect insurance proceeds. So anything funky like that, when we have to sift through financial records, that's what a forensic accountant or FA does. We deliver expert witness testimony on our findings and our work. That work could be business valuation, business dissolution, if a partnership dissolves and you want to figure out how much each partner walks away with, Divorce matters, same thing. You're splitting. How much does each spouse get? Bankruptcy matters. Obviously, we do a lot of fraud investigations. Internal auditing, we may do some compliance auditing, compliance with contracts. That's not necessarily numbers involved. And then just general business consulting. So when you are poking around on your community-based forensic accountant's website, you'll probably see terms like this, and that will indicate that they do forensic accounting outside of traditional financial statement audits and tax returns. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of background. One other important consideration as you think about hiring your forensic accountant is whether they are public or law enforcement based or private or community based. If your forensic accountant is law enforcement based, whether that is with police or your district attorney's office, generally those individuals, by the terms of their employment agreements, are only able to work on active criminal matters. And as we know, not many of our cases rise to the criminal level, at least immediately. So you need a community-based forensic accountant to do that preliminary work, as well as step in other cases like guardianships that don't have a criminal element and things like that. So why that matters, distinguishing between the two, it really depends on the needs of your case. A lot of the times we're just trying to get enough evidence to get law enforcement involved, right? Maybe we want to enhance a guardianship petition and there's no criminal element, so the forensic accountant embedded in the DA's office wouldn't be able to work on that. And other times, as we'll touch on a little bit later, it's simply to get the victim to understand, if they can, or their family member, what's really going on, and to help them make a decision with what they want to do in terms of maybe revoking a POA or pursuing an eviction of a freeloading nephew or something like that. So making that distinction between law enforcement based and community based may be very important for your team. So just give that some thought. To find a community based forensic accountant, the first thing you should be looking for is certifications. At minimum, you want a CPA, certified public accountant, and I have a specialty fraud investigation certification called a CFE. That means Certified Fraud Examiner. There are all kinds of other certifications a forensic accountant might have. There's something called a CFF, Certified in Financial Forensics. There's a CIA, Certified in Internal Auditing. But at the very least, make sure the individual you engage is a CPA. They carry a lot of weight on the stand. There's a lot of professional standards surrounding the public trust, objectivity that you want to make sure is incorporated in their work. To find a CPA in your area, there is first a website called cpaverify.org. They maintain a database of all active licensed CPAs. CPAs can lose their licenses for malpractice and things like that. So you want to check CPA Verify to make sure that your CPA is appropriately licensed and practicing. Some jurisdictions don't report to cpaverify.org, so it may be easier for you to call or look up your state society of CPAs. Every state has a state society because state education departments administer the CPA license. So check with them, ask them, do you have a forensic accountant that you're aware of that serves my area? You can also look, our professional organization, the American Institute of CPAs, they have a Find a CPA database. And I've included the link on this slide here. Again, not every member keeps their profile up to date. Not every member fills one out. You don't have to be a member of the AICPA if you are a practicing CPA, but in general, you want someone who is, because the AICPA provides that CPA with all the appropriate professional standards as they change. Like I talked about earlier, Certified Fraud Examiner, that's a certification that's issued by the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. They have a Find a CFE link on their website. Again, it's user generated, so not everybody has a profile established. Not every CFE that's listed there has indicated they're also a CPA, but it is a start, and you can search within a certain mile radius. A couple other considerations: if you have limited resources and you want to try something a little more creative, think about retired investigators that came out of law enforcement. Would they be interested in offering some services to you for free of charge? The way that I got started in this work back in 2009, I was in graduate school, and it was through a student internship program. Lifespan of Greater Rochester, who's a partner on this grant, had a bunch of financial exploitation cases that they needed help with. So they reached out to my college and said, I know you have a master's in forensic accounting program. Can one of your students help us out and do an internship? So in that case, you know, you're paying college intern rates versus public CPA firm rates. That might be an option. One other thing, it's not a bullet on this slide, but a consideration is, as you'll see, a lot of the work in the forensic accounting realm is data entry and data analysis, unless you have the software to do the data entry for you. What we did in the early days before we had this software was to have the coordinators themselves do some data entry to help out. So that way, the forensic account, you were only paying the forensic accountant to do the actual analysis of the data, not so much, you know, the data entry to get it into an easily analyzable spreadsheet. So that's a consideration. If you have any questions on this, throw them in the chat box or talk to me via email after. But finding a CPA or someone to help you, a forensic accountant or someone to help you, these are some options. When you've identified your forensic accountant, there are 5 ways we stay involved with your team, 5 touch points, if you will. The first is meeting participation. And meeting participation means we're either there in person, obviously post-COVID when we can all meet again, or over phone call or Zoom or something like that. It doesn't have to be every single meeting. You know, obviously we're a small practice. We can't be at all the E-MDT meetings every other week or every month, however often we have them. So we have to work really closely with the coordinator to decide, is this a meeting where there's a case that a forensic accountant should be involved in, or can the FA sit this one out? So meeting participation is the first point. Training is another point. I would ask your forensic accountants to deliver as much training as you need, down to the basics like financial literacy or how to read a bank statement. The biggest training I think that we do is, you know, what documents to look for and what information do we look for in those documents. The FA can help you with that. Consultations and case analysis are the 2 real work areas that we do. I'll talk about those a bit later, but consultations are like quick phone calls or emails, maybe from the field or back in your office, say, hey, I've got this case. I'm really not sure what direction to take with it. What items should I look for next? Or which direction should I go? How should my request read? You know, something you can call us from the field or call your forensic accountant or send them an email and they can give you a quick answer. That's an example of a case consult. Case analysis on the other side is, you've got that big box of records, you're turning it over to your FA, and they're going to turn around a report or other deliverable that's going to explain in plain English what happened. Normally, we spend the bulk of our time on case analysis. And depending on the outcomes desired for those cases and the findings that we come up with, it might wind up in court. And at that point, we can give witness testimony on our findings. So those are the 5 ways your forensic accountant should be able to get involved. And, you know, when you're sitting down and having conversations, if you haven't already, and the FA asks, you know, what are my roles? These 5 things are it. So how do you know when to get a forensic accountant involved? What are your goals for the case? We have identified 5 in our work over the years on the New York State E-MDTs. And the first, honestly, the most common is supporting an APS investigation. Adult Protective Services workers generally are social workers who don't have any sort of finance education or accounting background that can give them a leg up to navigating these cases. They need a lot of support from a financial expert. Similarly, law enforcement need the same thing. Maybe they went through a criminal justice program and not so much white collar crime. That's why you need the financial experts. Criminal prosecution, obviously to serve as expert witnesses. Same thing for enhancing a guardianship petition. Either we will put a report together that the county attorney takes and handles on their own, or we go and testify on that report in the guardianship hearing. And then the fifth element that we touched on a little bit earlier is just informing the victim or the family what really went on. These cases are so complex and so confusing that they're difficult for advocates to adequately research and explain. If you have a financial expert, we can sit down and say, here's what happened, how it happened, and here are some recommended next steps. And that will move the case farther along faster than if everybody was trying to navigate this on their own. So those are really the 5 goals of a case when you're making a referral for case analysis. To make that referral, the referring agency would gather all the facts of the case that they could and reach out to the E-MDT coordinator. And as the coordinator, you are going to do your formal intake, so you fulfill all your grant requirements, capture your demographic data, and then you're going to assess the facts of the case and see whether they meet the criteria for acceptance by the E-MDT. What is the goal, and is this a case that meets one of those? And assuming you've authorized the case for referral to the FA, you would then connect the agency with your forensic accountant. On our side, what the forensic accountant is going to do, they're going to review the intake form if you choose to turn that over, or they're going to create their own and maybe have an intake phone call to ask you, who's the victim, who's the suspect, what is the nature of the case, that kind of thing. We're going to inquire about the goal, like where do you want to go with this? The distinction there is important because in a criminal case that law enforcement is involved, the goal is criminal prosecution, we are limited to reporting on the facts, right? We cannot get on the stand and make an opinion. So in a criminal prosecution case, we are going to stick to the facts and we are going to prepare our report to criminal prosecution legal standards. On the guardianship side, we can be a little bit more flexible. In general, on the guardianship side, we're going to wind up making an opinion on whether the victim or the suspect is able to manage their finances anymore. So we're going to tailor and write our report a little bit differently to that end. So make sure when you're referring the case to us, you're establishing what is the goal. At that point, we're going to tell you here are the records that we want. We're going to review those records when they come in, and then we're going to produce the deliverables that you need to adequately solve or serve your case. So that's the case analysis piece. Consultation is a little bit different, and this will be kind of a trial error thing for your teams. When we started out on the case consult side saying that the agency needs to reach out to the coordinator to say, I've got a case for a case consult, and then the coordinator reaches out to the forensic accountant. Sometimes, like we talked about earlier, that's a quick call from the field. Well, to make the quick call to the coordinator, who then has to get a hold of the forensic accountant, might draw out the process. So if you as the coordinator are comfortable, you can set up the direct link between the agency and the forensic accountant. You just make sure that the agency and the forensic accountant lets you know every single time they do a case consult so that you can capture it for your reporting purposes. So set it up however you want, but same thing, gather the facts of your case, the coordinator does an intake, or the coordinator gets the information after you've done the consult so that they can coordinate documentation. And for our part, we'll review the intake, review the facts, and respond to whatever questions you have or whatever your need is. So that's the referral process in a nutshell. Pretty straightforward, pretty easy. Some considerations for referrals, obviously, financial exploitation cases are really complex. And what we mean by complex generally is your case or the agency's case has an urgent deadline and you just don't have the manpower, or the skills to get it done within the time frame necessary. Sometimes we get a case and it's like, we've got a court hearing next week. What can you do for us? We can shift our workload around and try to get you as much information as we can by that deadline. So urgency is one thing. A lot of the cases that we get, it's because there's this complex account structure. You've got bank accounts, you have investment accounts, there's money moving back and forth, and a caseworker or law enforcement officer is just like, I can't read this. I don't know what's going on, tell me. So Sometimes we'll get cases because the duration of abuse, it's been going on for so long that there's no way to see, what was that activity before and now what is it? So we have to kind of take a closer look at what seems normal and what doesn't based on our intake information. Sometimes there's commingling of funds and we have to get in there and decide, what spending was the suspects and what spending was the victims. And then beyond that, if they're commingling funds, if the suspects made deposits of their own money, well, then we have to reduce whatever spending we attributed to the suspect by that amount because technically they were spending their own money. So how do you quantify that? Commingling of funds, we get those cases a lot. Sometimes unknown spending habits. You're working with a victim or the agency is working with a victim who just has no comprehension of their financial situation anymore. They can't tell you what their regular bills are. They can't even tell you what their bank is. We have to really dig in and try to piece that information together on our own. Again, when guardianship is desired, law enforcement involvement is desired. You want to get law enforcement interested in a case because so far they haven't been. We can hopefully do that for you. And again, client acknowledgement. You just need the client to change their mind about revoking a POA or something like that, or their cooperative agent. So in any case, what you provide the forensic accountant is a brief narrative, if you can. Sometimes that takes place on an intake form. Other caseworkers and agencies we work with like to just do a write-up on their own or summarize it in an email when they send it over. But at the very basic, we're looking for a victim name. We're looking for the perp name. What is their relationship? Do they share a home? Are they related? Is there a POA or a healthcare proxy element to it? And what is the primary concern? And I say primary concern because sometimes we get a case, it's like, here's a victim, here's a suspect, and here's 5 years of financial records. And we don't get a response on, what is your primary concern? So this one case in particular, I remember there were so many investment accounts over years and years. We couldn't get a hold of the caseworker after it was referred to figure out what's the primary concern, what should we be looking for? So we're like, well, we'll just go through our normal analysis, see what we find, and that's that. And so it took us, I don't know, a month to get through all of this stuff, 2 months. And we send the report over in draft form with these, what we have found, not knowing what the major issue was. And the caseworker comes back and they were like, oh, we were only looking for this one $30,000 check. It's like, oh my gosh, we just spent so many months on this. So definitely communicate what your primary concern is, because that's going to save a lot of time and money. We're going to want whatever bank statements, financial records, and supporting documents that you have pulled together. Those supporting items might be not just the statements, but the deposit items at the very least, so we can see the money coming in. Withdrawal slips, if they withdrew money and their signature is on there, and canceled checks. So if nothing else, try to get us the bank statements, deposit slips, withdrawal slips, and canceled checks on the bank side. If there's a power of attorney document, we want to see that. If the agent has produced an accounting, even if it's the worst accounting you've ever seen and it's a couple of receipts, throw that in there. We generally recommend, if you can, to get a credit report. I know that that's kind of a sticky situation because the client has to have, consent to you requesting the credit report. And in a lot of cases, our clients can't consent. But if they can, or you have an agent who's cooperative, or you've got a law enforcement worker who can subpoena the credit report, that's a great place to look, because we're not just concerned about the cash that went out, what assets the person has. We also want to see the debt side of the picture, and the credit report will do that. And then any other statements and records that you've collected along the way. And, I generally tell people, like, send us everything. People might think, oh, I don't know if we should send this. It's not necessarily a bank statement. Honestly, we find so many little golden nuggets in these other pieces of information that can really blow a case wide open. So just send us everything. We'll decide what we want and what we don't, but more is better. So that's the documentation side. Tips for requesting bank records. the only way that a forensic accountant can look, well, there are 3 ways, I should say, that a forensic accountant can get records. We can't request them ourselves. We need to rely on the people who have authority to do that. That is APS and law enforcement, or through a cooperative agent or with the consent of the client. So anytime you're requesting documents, I like the request to say, you know, any and all of the following items and accounts held individually and jointly by the victim. And then this any and all accounts piece is really important, because if you send a request to the bank for, say, a certain account number, the only information you're going to get back is that specific account number. You're not going to find out probably till later when you're looking through records that some other account exists that the victim is joint, maybe with the suspect on. So any and all accounts held individually and jointly by the victim, and that will hopefully capture, you know, most, if not all, of what the victim has at that particular institution. Like we touched on a little bit earlier, we don't just want the monthly statements. Monthly statements are great, you know, they're the crux of the case, really. But if, you know, the statement says on March 14th there was, you know, check number 401 for $300, we don't know who that check went to. We have to request the copies of the canceled checks to see whether that was something spent for the benefit of the victim or for the suspect. We want account opening and change documents, because those will tell us who the owner of the account is, was it changed at any time, who are the beneficiaries on the account, and was that changed at any time, that kind of thing. And they give you a sample, hopefully, of what the victim's signature really looks like. So when you're seeing signatures on the rest of the documents, while we're not handwriting experts, we can't testify to that, we can at least put it up in court and say, this looks weird. Deposit items, we want to know what's going in just as much as what's coming out. And I will give you the particular example. We had a case where there was a woman who had, a handyman had stolen $47,000 worth of jewelry. We didn't know that until we got the bank records back. We saw a $47,000 deposit in the bank account. And so we went back, requested the deposit item, and it was a check from an insurance company. And the memo line said, for a lost jewelry claim. So what this guy had done is taken the jewelry, pawned it, helped her fill out the insurance form to get the insurance proceeds, and then deposited those proceeds and took that money again. So deposit items are equally important. You know, what's coming in as what's going out. Withdrawal slips, we look at signatures. You know, if somebody was joint on the account, who was at the bank making that withdrawal? Generally, you have to sign for it. Copies of canceled checks we talked about, both the front and the back side are really important. They give you all kinds of information. Teller notes, a lot of the times banks have records of money that was moved back and forth between accounts, you know, who showed up at the bank with the victim at a certain time. Transfer details, if a transfer goes out of the bank, what financial institution did it go to, what account number, and that gives you a lead on what the next round of subpoenas should look like. We want to see power of attorney documents. We want to see copies of certified checks from the bank. Sometimes people pay their bill, you know, or buy a car through a certified check, not a regular one. And on the debt side of things, not just depository accounts, but we want to know what kind of debt is out there. Any mortgages, any loans? What about credit cards? Those statements are helpful too. So in a not so nutshell, those are the financial records at the very least we want to request. Other helpful documents, the power of attorney is really great. We have had a couple cases where the power of attorney document that the suspect supplies doesn't match exactly the one that's on file with the bank or the one that was filed at the county clerk's office, because this individual altered his copy to grant himself a couple extra powers, you know, than the client had initially authorized. So those are always interesting to take a peek at. Healthcare proxy, who is making healthcare decisions? Is that the same person that is in charge of something like the trust or the client's assets, and might they be withholding necessary care so that their payout on the back end when the client passes is higher? Those are considerations we look at. Wills, what are their end of life wishes? Were they changed recently? County clerk records, what kind of property do they have or other assets? Is there a gun in the house? Pistol permits and things are on file there. Life insurance policies, who are the beneficiaries, who pays for them? Credit card statements like we talked about, investment account statements if they have investments. Medical records we like to see too, at least as much as you can share. And we want to know, was a victim hospitalized? We want to know, was there any kind of capacity evaluation done or a doctor's note that said this particular client can't make financial decisions. Resident facility records are helpful too. They might tell us who is in and out on a certain day. They might tell us again when the client was hospitalized. They will also tell us what level of care is being provided for the victim and what other services are covered. So if the nursing home, or resident facility agreement says your $11,000 rent covers your room, 3 meals, your cable, and your utilities, I probably shouldn't see cable and utilities coming out separately from the account. So that's why, documents you might think don't matter do in terms of doing the forensic accounting. In New York State, and it's probably similar in other states as well, APS and law enforcement have the ability to demand an accounting from the agent. And here in New York State, our Adult Protective Services has what we call a 15-day letter. It's a standard form, and it just says that, such and such county is investigating this case. You need to provide an accounting to us of how you spent this victim's funds within 15 days. And if you don't produce that accounting within 15 days, we can bring a special proceeding to remove you as the agent. And one county here in New York, Onondaga in particular, the Syracuse area, they use this 15-day letter standard. The minute they get a financial exploitation case that involves a POA, they're requesting the bank records and they're demanding an accounting. And that it has been really helpful in terms of intervention. So obviously you don't have to have a standard form, just make sure that it is allowable for you under your power of attorney laws. Try to demand that accounting. See what that person says about how they spent their funds. What I love is to put in our reports, we'll go through, we'll do our accounting and we'll say, $40,000 is assumed to benefit the suspect or unaccounted for. And the suspect will come back and say, well, I really only spent $10,000. We can put a finding in there that says, we see that 40 is missing. This guy says 70 is missing. He obviously can't keep track of his responsibilities. He's not eligible to be a POA. So we've gone down that route before. That's the POA accounting. When you are making your case, you can approach it the same way that we do, whether you use the forensic accountant or not. And when you are referring a case to us, kind of structuring your referral in this way is really helpful. Give us a timeline. What was the date a POA was signed? When was the suspect involved? What was the victim's capacity determination at that time, if there was one? Even maybe APS has done a mini mental or something like that. Dates hospitalized, etc. We summarize the bank records by their monthly cash flows, sometimes yearly, depending on what paints the best picture. The inflows by source we list out and how much, and then the outflows and where they went by use. We'll reconcile those inflows and outflows and make sure we've captured all the data so that we can reconcile the beginning balance in the account and the ending balance and all the activity that went on in between. We also compare patterns and deviations that we observe in the bank records to our timeline. Say, all right, I know that this change took place in May 16th. Does that line up when this individual was appointed as POA? Did it happen before or after? And also compare the suspect's accounting to yours. That's very helpful. And finally, writing a brief narrative that documents the facts of the case, different findings noted when you went through the records, any references to individual pieces of evidence. So if you know that it was on the May 2016 bank statement, put that note in there so that we don't have to reperform your work just to find that same answer. And then conclude your report, if you use one. Hopefully your forensic accountant takes this approach with some recommendations for next steps. I found this, here's the direction that we should go next. Case examples that have come to the E-MDT, you know, our larceny statutes, we had this handyman, and man moved into an apartment complex. He lived there for a long time. This new handyman came around and befriended him. And eventually, the older adult wasn't able to ambulate as well anymore. So he reached out to this handyman, said, here, you know, can you take my debit card and go to the grocery store for me? So the handyman does this a few times and then starts helping himself to the ATM. Well, the referral came in because the handyman was using the debit card at the ATM while the guy at the corner store down the street knew that the older man was hospitalized. So we were able to kind of quantify all the money that he had stolen while the older adult was hospitalized. That resulted in a successful indictment. Our perp pled guilty and restitution was ordered. I don't know what happened to the payment, but you know, at least the restitution was ordered. On the guardianship side of things, we had a woman who was in court for a foreclosure, and she had taken out a mortgage from her sister. They owned a property together. She didn't have money, the sister did, so the sister gave her a mortgage. The woman failed to pay that mortgage, so the sister started foreclosing on her. So she was really struggling, and there was a man conveniently outside the courthouse who heard her sob story and said, oh, here, you know, let me help you. So he goes and he takes her to get a reverse mortgage, and he basically walked off with the proceeds check. So in that case, we turned it over to law enforcement, and we filed, APS, the team recommended, we filed an Article 81 to, in New York State, appoint a guardian to manage her financial situation. She was easily preyed upon by this guy. She still had real estate troubles. She was going to be preyed upon again. So that's what we did in the guardianship case. You know, and sometimes financial exploitation cases come in, and what looks like financial exploitation on its face really actually isn't. And in this last example, we had a woman whose husband passed away, and she was paying a mortgage on her home, you know, their family home, and his hunting trailer, but only on her Social Security. So she had this nephew that became her POA after the husband died, and he moved into the trailer and started operating a car repair shop out of it. So the referral came into APS saying, hey, we got this neighbor, you know, this nephew that just moved in, and he's totally taking advantage of her using her assets. Well, we, you know, went in and poked around in the financial records and found that he was depositing the revenues from his car repair shop into their joint bank account. And because of that, she was able to make her payments on both assets each month. Had he not been operating the car repair shop and depositing his revenues into that account, she wouldn't have been able to afford them both. And she wasn't ready to get rid of the trailer because emotionally she was attached to it. So what we were able to do was get together with the suspect, recommend that they just keep separate accounts, because as a POA, he shouldn't have been joint on it anyway. He paid for the trailer and all those expenses out of the one account, and she paid for her home and her expenses out of the other, and everybody walked away happy. So sometimes there's like good things that come out of the forensic accounting, but without doing it, we never would have known. And so that was a good result. Some lessons we learned, like I talked about earlier, we've been doing work on the E-MDTs since 2012. And, you know, there are the 6 areas that we learned lessons on the hard way. I figured I'd put in here and talk through with you. The first we already talked about, that's the difference between community-based and law enforcement-based forensic accountants. The other issue with the law enforcement-based forensic accountants, unless you work out an agreement, is they generally cannot share the results of their investigations. But as we know on the E-MDTs, everybody working together and sharing information is how our intervention efforts are so successful. So on the community-based side, they may not be held to that standard, and they can freely and openly communicate. If you can, make some fraud investigator contacts at the local banks, and definitely the local major banks in your area, because APS encounters a lot of resistance when they go to request bank records and the bank says we can't turn these over. because of Graham-Leach. And hopefully your APS is educated to say, no, there is this carve out within Graham-Leach that allows us to access these records. If you've got a contact at a bank that knows about that authority and has a good relationship with you and your team, maybe they even sit on your team, that is going to be hugely helpful in getting financial records in your cases. Use of OCR, text recognition software. Hopefully your forensic accountants aren't manually entering the data. There are a lot of OCR tools out there now that they can use, because if they're hand entering that information, like we talked about earlier, you're paying for that time. It'd be better to pay them for, you know, the actual value add, which is analyzing that data. Like we talked about earlier, asking for everything. So it prevents a lot of back and forth. Ask for everything up front, everything that we talked about on that records tip sheet. When you are working on guardianship cases and cases for criminal prosecution, you know, anything that involves an attorney working on it, we like to keep, the forensic accountants, draft on our work papers so that they are protected by attorney-client privilege. You know, sometimes we get information on the intake side that later we find out wasn't 100% accurate. It would be really bad if we put that in our report and relied on it when we should have known, or at least double checked later, that you know, what the actual facts were. So we keep everything labeled draft until like literally the night before grand jury or the night before we testify in a guardianship hearing, so that we've got all the available information and it's protected from being disclosed to the other side. So attorney work product, keeping things draft till the last minute, that's good. The other very important lesson that we learned, have a conversation with your district attorney's office on, and this is when you are hiring a community-based forensic accountant, have a conversation with your DA's office on their position on sharing orders. What a sharing order is when the grand jury issues a subpoena to a bank, you know, it's so-and-so bank, I'm requesting these records for investigating a case. The sharing order tells the bank, I am going to release these records to a third party. And it documents the chain of custody, who has those records. Here in New York, there are two schools of thought. There are some DAs who believe that every single time you're going to involve a forensic accountant, you should have a sharing order attached to your subpoena. We had $1 million case at one point, and the sheriff's investigator forgot to put the sharing order on it, and it was thrown out. Don't lose, don't learn that hard lesson like we did. Have a conversation with your DA. If my forensic accountant is going to work on this case, do they need a sharing order? So that's very important. Deliverables, I'll show you visuals in a minute. There are 3 kinds of deliverables we use in our work. Sometimes it's just a preliminary schedule or reconciliation. You just get this sheet of numbers and it says, here's your beginning balance. Here's everything that came in and from where, and everything that went out and to where. Now, obviously, they can be a little more detailed. Sometimes they're 3 pages long, depending on how active the account was. But it basically gives you a visual depiction of what came in and what went out. So that is the preliminary schedules. We'll send those to you, say what activity looks normal, what doesn't, because we don't know everything. You're closest to your client or the agency, APS or law enforcement. We may issue a memo in addition to that preliminary schedule. And the memo is just a brief narrative that kind of translates that financial schedule into words, because not everybody's a number person. We realize that. We'll put it in a nice short memo and shoot it off to you so that you can decide where you want to go with it. Once you decide where you want to go with it, and it involves some sort of legal intervention, then we're going to write a full-on report. And that report is going to be drafted in accord with standards for whatever legal proceeding we're going to go forward with. Grand jury, trial, etc. So those are the 3 different types. If you just need information really quick, you know, like maybe understanding what went on in the account and whether financial exploitation appears to be occurring, I would say just get the preliminary schedules. Learn to read those charts. We'll help you read those charts if you want. but only have the forensic accountant write a full-on report when you need that report for some sort of legal proceeding. So that's just a recommendation there. If you really, really want a written narrative for your file, probably just request a memo and say, we'll leave this in our file, and that's that. So 3 different types of deliverables that we use. We talked about the schedules, the narratives themselves. The memorandum is just an abbreviated version of the report, really. It has a scope section, the scope saying, here are the accounts we looked at and the period that we looked at. Here are some background facts and assumptions that we used to get to our findings. Here are some numerical charts of our findings. And then if we have some select recommendations, we'll drop those in there in bullet points and attach those supplementary schedules to it. On the report side, it is a full report prepared in accord with our professional standards. It has the scope section. It has a background section. It summarizes all of the findings and attributions, in summary charts. But then there's a detailed narrative of all our findings, all the activity in the account, and the basis for those. Again, some recommendations possibly for the team, and then the supporting schedules. Very important, of course, that the report for legal purposes is marked draft until it's final. That's the narratives. When I talk about summary charts and attributions, I mean this. If you look at this chart, for this particular client or victim, we looked at 4 bank accounts, and you can see those on the left. Spending from those accounts, less the transfers, money moving back and forth between them, because we don't want to double count those assets, totaled 1.7 million over the period that we looked at. Of that 1.7 million, 752,000 was for the benefit of the client. That was probably home care expenses, groceries, that kind of thing. 626,000 was attributed to the suspect, and I'll dive into that a little bit in a minute. 344,000 was this category we call unaccounted for, and unaccounted for means we just didn't have enough information or evidence either way, to attribute it to the client or the suspect. But maybe we're able to show that the unaccounted for funds only occurred after the suspect was involved or something like that to tie them together. So that is a summary of the total net spending in the account. Then we'll break it down. Here's what funds attributed to the suspect looked like. Obviously, in this case, there were checks payable directly to the suspect. Sometimes they were deposited in her account, sometimes she cashed them. The biggest category in this particular case, this woman was writing checks to cash, and she was legitimately going and cashing them. They never made it to her account. $510,000. This woman was a gambler, and so she was financially exploiting the woman she was caring for to feed her gambling habit. But we'll break it down. And when law enforcement reads this, they might say, all right, can you get me then a supplemental list of all the checks written to her, the dates, the amounts, what the memo line said, et cetera, which we could do, but they have it summarized right here. Other illustrative exhibits we might throw in, visual depictions of spending. Sometimes we don't need to create them ourselves. We pull them right from the documents. This is obviously an investment account statement. We just took a screenshot from a credit score that tanked after the suspect got involved. We might pull that out and put it in the report. And then our deliverables can be used for any one of the following things. I think we talked a lot about in this presentation, criminal prosecution and guardianship, but the team in its collective wisdom can come up with all of these creative ways to get the suspect out of the victim's picture. And sometimes that's, filing claim with the IRS, and the IRS does the investigation, or the state tax authority if law enforcement really isn't interested. Maybe you can get the suspect on welfare or insurance fraud, because certainly they weren't recording all the money they stole as income, right? We might work on contractor scams, and then again, victim or family understanding. I know we have just about 10 minutes left. So the last few things I want to talk about, confidentiality. Our practice here in New York has been that all E-MDT participants individually, I'm not signing one for my firm and it covers everybody. All my team members every year sign a confidentiality agreement for every team that says we're not, information shared at this table does not leave. and we're going to protect the personally identifiable information. Your forensic accountants, assuming they are CPAs and CFEs like we talked about, we're bound by professional standards that prohibit disclosure of confidential information. Believe me, if we want to keep our licenses, we're not going to disclose it. But a very important consideration on the confidentiality side is, what are the different agencies' requirements for confidentiality? Certainly APS has their own, law enforcement definitely has their own in terms of sharing grand jury records like we talked about. Definitely discuss how you plan to share records with a third party, your forensic accountant, prior to engaging them on a certain case, just so you avoid like the sharing order issue we talked about. So that's confidentiality. Contract considerations, forensic accountants, assuming they are CPAs or CFEs certified, they have professional standards that outline what need to be included in all of their contracts. Our contracts aren't necessarily called contracts. We operate using engagement letters. Our engagement letters will specify that this is a consulting engagement. I know when we're looking at financial records, people tend to call our work an audit. An audit in like CPA professional terms means basically you're examining financial records, financial statements, profit and loss, balance sheet, and certifying that they're accurate. That's not what we're doing in these cases. We're just reviewing personal financial records to determine what happened, not that they're accurate, right? They will, that's why it's a consulting engagement and not an audit. They will reference the applicable standards that we're working under. So if you were so inclined, you can look up our standards and see that we're operating with integrity, objectivity, etc. Our letters will define the scope of services. Here's what we're going to do. Here's what we're going to charge for those services. And then they'll have language on limitations on liability, how to handle disputes, etc. You should expect to pay an hourly rate for our services. I've done a lot of thinking in the past, how could I flat fee this? But really these cases are Pandora's box. And I think it's impossible. Maybe your FAs can figure something out. Definitely let me know if they do. What you can do, because I know your agencies all have your own standard contracts, I would just tell your forensic accountant, put together your normal engagement letter, and we'll attach that to the back of our contract as some sort of appendix or something. That way your terms apply, their terms apply, and everybody's happy. So those are your considerations over contracting. Some, real quick, there are 2 tools that are available publicly, free, no charge. One way to really marshal your forensic accounting resources and use them appropriately is to try to have your agencies work the cases up as far as they can go, and then determine, this is way out of my league, we need the forensic accountant. One way to do this in New York State, our APS, we worked together to come up with what we called the FEIST, and that's the Financial Exploitation Investigation Suite of Tools. It was built specifically for caseworkers to basically walk them through step by step a financial exploitation investigation. Here's a checklist of questions to ask your clients. Here's a checklist of red flags, and if you see so many of them, probably financial exploitation is going on. And if it is, now you take this step. So if you take that next step, launch a full investigation, here's where you can document all the income and expenses are normal, so that when we go back, when you go and look at the financial records, the bank statements, you can see, here's the normal activity. Everything outside of that may be abnormal and require additional investigation. And then there's another checklist you can use as you review the bank statements to look for specific items that are generally indicative or red flags of financial exploitation. The FEIST also comes with some supplementary documents which you might find helpful. There's a client data form that you can use as an intake form if you want. The client account log is the place where you can document all of the financial accounts you're aware of and whether you've requested them or received them back from the bank. There's a document review guide. This one's my favorite because not only does it give you a whole list of documents that you should request, it tells you when you get those documents, here's specifically what you should be looking for, and there's space on the side for you to make notes on those things. So that's really helpful. And then ultimately, there's also a forensic accountant referral checklist. And it helps the user decide, is this a case that's beyond the scope of my ability that I should refer to the forensic accountant? So that is the Feist. If you're interested in a copy of it, just send me an email. My email is at the end of this presentation, and I will forward you a copy of the tool and the manual that goes with it. There's only one piece specific to New York. You might just have to adapt to your state, but it's kind of a non-issue. Finally, the SAFTA tool. This is a project we did in partnership with the DOJ and the International Association of Chiefs of Police. And it was built for law enforcement, and it's more of the Excel-based financial analytics piece. You enter all your data in off the bank statements, and it pre-populates all of these charts that might be helpful for you to use in A, analyzing, and B, presenting your case in court. So the SAFTA tool exists along with an accompanying guide that walks you through how to use the tool and also different phases of a financial exploitation investigation. So you can access the SAFTA tool from this link here at the IACP website. That is all the information that I have for you today. Hopefully it answered a lot of your questions, and I think we have about 5 minutes left. So let me go up to my chat and see what you guys are asking. I have 7 comments here. Someone asked, why do you believe the individual needs to be a CPA when a fraud investigation requires a fact-based opinion? I recommend that an individual is a CPA based on the professional standards that they hold themselves to, and if it is going to court, you basically have to be certified as an expert in your field, and the CPA credential generally is enough to be admitted as an expert. Who pays the forensic accountant for case analysis? If your team has funding specifically for forensic accounting services, generally it is the agency that holds the contract, I think, for the E-MDT. I understand FA consultations are expensive. How expensive are they? A forensic accountant anywhere is going to, I don't know what the rates, they vary across the state or across the United States based on your area, but I would expect to pay a forensic accountant at least $100 an hour. It will be 3 figures per hour, unless you can negotiate some pro bono work. You know, maybe you can have them attend your team meetings pro bono as, you know, an opportunity for networking for them, but when they actually do their work, they're getting paid. And then we talked about trying to reduce that cost by maybe hiring some interns instead to do the lower level type of work, maybe having the coordinator doing some data entry or lower level work so that the forensic accountant is the only one that is doing the high level stuff. I would suggest you work with your forensic accountant on, you know, what are the tasks that we can give somebody in-house that we're already paying for, and what are the higher level tasks that you can take so that we can control what we're spending. And then there's a last question here. Does a POA have ability to request a credit report? Yes, yes. So if your POA is not the suspected perpetrator and is cooperating with you, that's definitely the way to go. Certainly if you're demanding an accounting, you can ask that agent to produce one as well. Are there any others? I'm going to stop my share right now, actually, so I can see everybody. Anyone have any additional questions? You want to raise your hand?
Hi, Karen. I had one more question that came in over the chat, and it's a little lengthy, so I'm just going to read it out for you. Mm-hmm. Our organization has a very robust set of provisions for our MOUs, one being adding our organization as an insured party on their liability insurance. How do you overcome FA concerns about adding additional organizations to a firm's liability insurance?
Oh, that shouldn't be an issue. A couple of my clients have requested that as well, and so I just call my insurance company and I put them on there.
Okay.
It actually is more or less standard practice, so you shouldn't be worried about that.
Okay, and thank you. And then one additional, how do you overcome barriers of engagement agreements required on the FA side for performing any work on E-MDT cases?
So I guess that depends on what the barriers are. Like if you can't come to terms with a forensic accountant, I don't know, do you have an example you could share? Are you currently struggling with yours? I mean, not to bore you, but I know that there is a sticking point. There are two types of forensic accounting engagements that we can enter into. One is a consulting engagement and one is an expert witness engagement. And based on how complex these cases are, they can flip from being consulting to an expert witness engagement. And in normal circumstances, when we're working on cases privately, we then just issue a different engagement letter that says, you know, now we are an expert witness and not so much a consultant. That is not the path that I have gone down. Here in New York, I've just put in our contracts that those expert witness services are included. But in many cases, it really doesn't go that far. I might testify once a year and we're in 40 counties. As long as it's really only a problem if you've got a forensic accountant who's putting some wild opinions in there. If you're strictly speaking to fact, generally the cases just settle.
Thank you so much. The question was from Laura, and she said that she would contact us privately about it. So we'll take that question offline.
Someone sent me a message actually privately. How many hours would I expect at minimum to conduct an analysis? And that is really, really tricky. On one case, I don't know, a simple case where it's like maybe a checking and a savings account that we're looking at, I don't know, 15 hours. But if you're looking at multiple investment accounts over 5 years, you could be looking at like 50 hours. And if it ultimately goes to trial, then you not only have to pay the expert, prep time, the time in testimony. If it gets rescheduled, you're paying that multiple times. It really depends. Any other questions?
All right, I'm not seeing any other questions coming in through the chat. We'll continue to leave that open if any more stream in. Thank you so much for the presentation today, Karen. It was very informative. Grace, did you have any final comments?
Yeah, just a final comment that Karen Weber is actually a specialist consultant with the National Center. So if following today's presentation, you have any questions and want to reach out to her, please feel free to get in touch with Kelly or put in a request through the TA request form, and we'll be sure to connect you with Karen. Thank you very much, Karen.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me, everyone.
All right, thank you so much for joining us. You all will be receiving the materials as well as a link to the recording following the presentation. We'll also be sending out an evaluation just to let us know what you found useful and what you'd like to see in future presentations. So look out for that. Thank you so much for coming, everyone.